Well, I run the Filmmakers Dialogue series with the School of Visual Arts, and the first time I met Michael was when I invited him to participate with a movie called Batangang Kipperbang in 1982, which was a small film made by Channel 4 about two young kids and first love kind of story. So Michael shows up, and I met him, and everything was nice, but the only thing that didn't show up was the film, because the distributor, United Artists, forgot to send the film. But we got through that, and the film came another day. And throughout the years, I've become friends with Michael. And you know, if you look at IMDb or Wikipedia, the first thing it says is that he's one of the most prolific filmmakers working, which is true because he has 76 movies that he's directed. I don't know how you've done that, but they range from the
I have
James...
a whole army underground.
Yeah.
I pass them out.
I mean, some of the titles would be from Narnia to the James Bond film to Thunderheart to the documentaries Incident of Ogalla, and of course the 7-Up series, which is classic, and everybody who has anything to do with documentaries has such a great love for that program. So we'll go through a lot of the films that Michael has directed, I guess, and we'll start with a clip from Coal Miner's Daughter, but first, here's the legendary Michael Apted. Is that okay to call you legendary?
A wet legend.
One legend?
A wet legend. No, this is my habitat. Rain from England. It always rains in England. So can I sit here and will they see the stuff? So we're going to amble through some stuff I've done, mindful that what's interesting probably to you about what I've done is that I've mixed up documentaries and feature films and how I work between the two, etc., etc. So there are not many of us who do that, so it's a little pin in my lapel, as it were. So the whole morning will kind of feature that in one way or the other. So let's just start with this clip from Coal Miner's Daughter, and then I'll explain why you're watching it. So the purpose of this was, I made this film in 1980, and it was the first film I did in America. I'd been directing for 15 or so years in the United Kingdom, and during all my early years I was moving around between documentaries and television plays and all this, because I worked for a small company that didn't really afford to have either or, so you had to do both and whatever. And I got sent this script. I was dying to work in America. I loved American films. The 80s was a great period for American films, the golden age. And I came here and I got this script and I got the job. And so I went about the job. And I went about a job that had the studios, Universal Studios, known what I was doing, they would have had a heart attack. They didn't even realize I was shooting the film on location until the weekend before I started. I got away with it because it was a low-budget film and they knew they'd get their money back on the soundtrack from Loretta Lynn. But anyway, the way I approached it, the way I'd learned my stuff in the United Kingdom with many mentors, Ken Loach, people like that, was if you're going to do a film about somewhere, you went there to do it. And so out I went to meet Loretta and to have a look at the Appalachians and to see her on the road and all this kind of stuff. With my intention was to shoot the whole thing on location, which is what I did. We recorded live singing out there. I had a sound recording unit there. And I cast it. I played this scene because the only two people who'd ever been in front of a camera in this scene was Sissy and Tommy Lee Jones. The rest of them were kids who were at the school. And that was the tone of the whole film. And in a sense, it came out remarkably well because Hollywood, American films that had a pretty bad record doing stuff in the Appalachians. They were all Hollywoodized and glamorized and whatever. I mean, there's some great films, Nashville and whatever, but nonetheless, there was something wrong about them. And this, unwittingly, I didn't know I was doing it. I was just doing my work and the way I did. Here was a film which was actually about the people and had the real people in it and the real locations in it. And because not many people knew much about this world, they knew about the music. I mean, Loretta was a big star, and it was the age of country music, Willie Nelson, etc. But anyway, this film illuminated, in a sense, a whole different world to the American audience. And so it was for me a very successful beginning, and I'm still living off it, 40 years later practically. But anyway, so that was really a very powerful lesson to me. It made me articulate my thoughts a bit about how to work, which was in a way second nature to me because that's all I knew. But the fact was that even in something as American as this, and I'd never heard of Loretta Lynn, didn't know anything about it before I came to go to work on the film, that there's no substitute for being there, no substitute for the truth of the matter, which is really, I suppose, the theme of all my work all the way through. Sometimes it's worked out, sometimes it hasn't worked out. But anyway, that's, please ask questions at any time during this, otherwise I'll just babble on forever. But I've got lots of clips to show, so it won't be too much. But if you want to ask anything.
I just wonder.
What?
Yeah, me.
Oh, you?
Yes. If since you were coming in not knowing much about Loretta Lynn,
Yes.
do you think that helped? I mean, did you approach it differently
It's a good,
as
very
from
good-
someone who lived here and would
It's
have
a very
known?
good question, because there's a number of films made by British directors that are kind of seminal. There's, what was the John Borman film? Set in Deliverance. Deliverance, Midnight Cowboy. And they were tended to be dealing with subjects that hadn't really been touched on very much. If I was to come here and do a film about Vietnam, I wouldn't do it. I just simply wouldn't take it on, because it's something I never lived through. Civil rights, something that being grown up in the United Kingdom, I knew nothing about that. And my friend Alan Parker took a bit of a battering for, what was his film called? Mississippi Burning, because again, he didn't really know what he was talking about. I mean, he's a great filmmaker, but he didn't know what he was talking about. So I think in some instances it does help. I mean, I came out looking kind of golden here because, God, I hadn't been, I hadn't trashed the Appalachian people. I hadn't patronized country music. It's because I didn't know any better, not because I was a better person than anybody else. Here was this singer, and here was this environment. This is where she lived, so we'll shoot it here. But it was a lesson to me that I presented a truthfulness because I didn't go in with too many preconceptions. It's good, everybody has preconceptions, but if you know something about something, some of those preconceptions are useful. But I never had any preconceptions about it because I knew nothing about it. So I'm not suggesting that everybody goes out and makes films about something they don't know about at all, but to go for the documentary truth of something, which you can always do with ever movie you do. I did it with the James Bond film to a point. It can be a great help, and it can also be a hindrance. You just have to be smart about the material you choose.
How much time do you spend with the real people, like Loretta Lynn and the people?
I went on the road with her, and they were really horrible to me. She travels in a bus, and they made me sleep above, that bit of the thing that drives the engine along. Miserable sods. I mean, so I just spent about a week with her, never getting any sleep at all. So I said to them, I'm going to punish you. This is me to myself. And I certainly did punish them. Because when I came to do that, this was with the band and her. She was wonderful, but the band was horrible to me. So when I came to do lots of concerts with her, I made them change costume every single song. I absolutely, and they didn't realize that I was torturing them. I was torturing them, but I was reminded of all those horrible nights trying to sleep on this fucking bus. So there's a mean streak to me. Anyway, so having set up that sort of my life in a way, I was then, about 10 years later, I was asked to do a documentary about Leonard Peltier. It's a story that took place in South Dakota when on the Pine Ridge Reservation There was a lot of political activity with the American Indian movement and a lot of action from the Nixon government and a lot of tension between the Native Americans and the government. And there was a murder where two FBI operatives got killed. And 3 men were charged, 2 were acquitted, and Leonard Peltier was convicted of it and sent to prison for life, and he's still in prison. Anyway, I was sent off to make a documentary about it, sort of in a way to say that American justice hadn't been at its very best and all that sort of stuff. While I was doing that, I got a script sent to me, which was about exactly the same subject. So I thought, hello. So I went up for this film, and of course I knocked them dead because I knew everything about it. But it seemed to me a unique opportunity to be making simultaneously a documentary and a movie, a feature film, about the same subject. And so it was kind of interesting because it showed me what movies do well, what movies can't do well, what documentaries do well, what documentaries can't do well. So I'll just show you a little bit, and I'll turn and face it so I can explain what I'm showing you. But one of the issues I had was it was very, very difficult to cast the feature film, which was called Thunderheart, because, again, it had to be real, had to be realistic. And at that time, there weren't very many good Native American actors, and there was very specific casting. So there was a mixture of me using people from the documentary as actors in with real actors. So just let's play this next little bit. There's bits of both films, so I'll sort of try and explain it. Off you go. So now this is a bit from the movie, and they're searching for an American Indian leader, and they can't find him. This is Val Kilmer, who's playing an FBI agent, and inside is another local actor playing an elderly. That's one of America's greatest living playwrights. That was Sam Shepard. So when I was presented with this script of this and all these characters, again, I realized that I couldn't cast this, as it were, from regular casting methods. And I did due diligence. I sat for days interviewing, talking to Native American actors, but none of them had this kind of fire or the look of the old man. And so I'd met some of these people doing the documentary, and then I went back to the reservation in South Dakota and found people and used them as actors. And it's something that's always, to me, very exciting to do that, because it's good for the story. I mean, you don't get a face like that old man out of SAG, as it were. And that kind of fire that Trudell has, Trudell lived this life, again, and that authority, you can't sort of buy that. So it's hard work. I mean, I had a wonderful moment with the old man who, after the first day, said, "I'm not coming back tomorrow, I don't like this." So we had to persuade him or bribe him to keep coming back. But you have to deal with that. And of course, these people had lived through the kind of violence on the reservation and whatever, and so they brought something to it that I couldn't bring to it, that certainly actors from California or New York couldn't bring to it, or even the writer couldn't bring to it. They brought a kind of wisdom to it. And so in almost everything I do, if I can't cast it out of, the vast body of actors, wherever I am, then I'll go out in the world and try and find someone to do it, which is, quite a lot of pressure. But it was, beyond that, it was a very interesting exercise for me to make the documentary, which was a very, very difficult documentary to make, because although the events had happened probably about 20 years before, there was still enormous anger about what had happened, how Nixon and the FBI had moved onto the reservation. They'd split the reservation down the middle. There were the purebloods and the half-bloods, and Nixon had put money in the hands of the half-bloods to arm them, and there was kind of a revolution going on, and a lot of people were killed, a lot of people died. and it had never been forgotten. And we went in to make this documentary, and it was pretty dangerous because we were dragging up old stuff, old wounds, particularly from the half-bloods who had kind of sold out their people for money and guns and whatever. And so, you know, it was kind of dangerous stuff. But anyway, I went in there and I shot a lot of stuff, and, you know, it turned out all right. But it was kind of long and rambling and all this. It didn't have really a good enough structure to it. It had tremendous moments in it because you knew you were looking at the real thing. You knew that these people had lived through this, and there it was. So it had that kind of truth to it. But as a piece of storytelling, it was quite difficult to understand, which is always the case with documentaries. And I always plead with students or whatever, or people who are doing documentaries, who are going into it, is I know what you mean when you go out and say, I'm just going to shoot it and see what I get. But you do have to have an idea. You do have to have, you can change the idea, but you do have to have some sense of some sort of structure to what you're doing. Because so many of the documentaries I see, and I see a lot, they fall down because they don't have a beginning, middle, and an end. And sometimes the story doesn't lend itself to that in a narrative way, but there's always a beginning, a middle, and an end to almost everything. And I found the fault with most documentaries is that they don't have a structure, so you don't know whether you're moving forward, sideways, or backwards. Now, when I did the movie, I had structure, but I had structure up the eyeballs. It was over-structured. It was so structured, again, it was almost incomprehensible because I knew what had happened. I wanted to honor what happened. I wanted to represent what happened, the various arguments, the various cases and whatever. And there was too much in the movie. The movie needed, if I was to go back to do it again, it would need thinning down because it was overwhelmed with structure and not enough of the real chill you get from looking at something you know really happened. So it made me, in a sense, when I do a feature film, to be a bit more loosey-goosey about it, to be open to having structural changes made to it, which can be pretty hair-raising, but to keep loose about it, not to get too bogged down in a scene or in a particular narrative to it, but to always have an open mind to it. Because whatever you're doing, a documentary or movie, you're trying to put life on the screen to an audience. Whatever you're doing, whether it's a cheesy comedy or whatever, blah, 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 you're trying to show life to people sat in an auditorium or sat at home watching the telly. And you know, the way to keep life in a movie is to make it real, to make these group of actors and this script, to bring it to life, to make it real. And so you've got to be alert to the fact that you don't want something that's so well kind of put together that it's lost its life. Similarly with a documentary, if you don't know where you're going with it, then you're going to get lost. And once you get lost, the movie's gone. And the number of films, again, documentaries I see that don't have some kind of center to it, even if it's a character development or a narrative development or whatever. I mean, I'm being hard on it, but I know you're all learning this and going into it and all that, so you may as well listen to my pennyworth of so-called wisdom too. But anyway, doing this thing, which I don't think anybody's ever done before, which is to actually do the same subject simultaneously as a movie and as a documentary. So it was a really rich experience from which I earned a lot, and not many people, I suppose, would ever have this chance. Again, not that they both weren't all right, they were all right, but they both could have been better, and they would have been better if I'd thought more about the differences between what I was doing, but you learn these things. Anyway, to show you life isn't all miserable or whatever, I took on a Bond film, which I'm going to show you a bit of that in a minute. They asked me to go and see them. I thought, what the hell, why do they want to see me? So I went along, we got on well. I still couldn't figure out why they wanted me to do it, but I wasn't going to argue with them. They offered me the job, so I took it, and it wasn't till well into it that I realized why they wanted it. But anyway, that presented me with a whole lot of situations and new things. I mean, I was in my late 50s when I did it, for God's sake, half dead. And I had to learn, a whole new trade. So here's a scene from the Bond which kind of illustrates what was, as it were, new to me. So play the Bond. So, boy, was that a change of speed. So I had to learn everything, from storyboards to stuntmen to whatever. We shot the thing on the Thames, actually through London, in an unbelievable manner. They made it available for every day for a few weeks while we did this. I had sort of 3 units working and all this kind of stuff. It was a whole new world, terrifying new world. And the only way I could protect myself was to know that the people I was hiring or were being hired knew what they were doing, had done this before. So the stunt coordinator, the assistant director, the second unit director, the third unit director, they'd all done a Bond before. So they knew what was going on. So I could then feed off them. I mean, the reason they'd asked me to do the film was that I'd had some success working with women in films. You know. So anyway, they wanted to try and encourage young women to go and see Bond. So the villain in the film was a woman, Sophie Marceau, and Judi Dench, who plays M, had much more to do in the film, and so that's why I got my marching orders, was because they wanted a director who could work with women. So that was why I was there. I didn't realize that for a bit, but it seemed a pretty thin excuse, but anyway. So it was kind of thrilling. It was a nightmare, because I remember we started preparation in August, and we started shooting in January, and we finished shooting in July. And so, it was an enormous amount of planning. We shot in many countries in the world and whatever. And for some reason, a little voice inside me, when it was early September, and I was panicking about, I had to make decisions about scenes I wouldn't shoot for another 8 months. I said to myself, pay attention, because you never know what's going to happen. Because I was so worried that there was so much to do, and we had to have it all sort of planned in between August and the end of the year. As I said, some of it I wouldn't shoot till June of the following year. So the lesson was, for some reason, my instinct was good, and I did pay attention. And sure enough, I mean, I would forget a lot, but something that was shot in sort of early March, I hadn't even thought about since early October. But because I'd done my homework and all that and prepared myself and all that, you know, I managed to scamper through it. But it was an extremely difficult thing to do because, as I said, there's so much of it, and to try and keep it in your head vaguely, even vaguely keep it in your head, was a challenge. So that was, you know, it was kind of great being put into such a pressure cooker. And also, you know, the other terrifying thing about doing a Bond or whatever it is, the expectation is enormous. You know that millions of people are going to see it, and you know the box office returns of mine was Bond 19, and I knew the box office returns of 1 to 18, how it was always going like this, and I thought, am I going to destroy this fucking franchise, which is the most successful franchise in the history of film in terms of longevity. So that was a real worry. I mean, most of the films I make, I worry about anybody going to see them. And you know, on Friday you go around to a cinema, there's 5 people outside. You think, another loser, never mind. But with this one, what was terrifying was millions of people were going to see it the day it opened, and you'd better deliver it. You know, and so much of it was alien. I mean, I had a guy whose sole job was to write one-liners for Bond, and all that, sat there all day writing one-liners. And to try and incorporate it into my pure filmmaking spirit was a bit of a struggle, but you know, we did survive, and we went on with that. It's not something I would recommend, but I think what you notice in Hollywood these days, which is kind of hideous, is that young directors seem to be doing these very big films. Not because people think they're going to be geniuses, it's because they can be bullied. I mean, the thing about God knows I'd done 30 years of films before I came to do this. So I did, even if I didn't have the first idea how to do it, I knew what was going on and what was sort of needed, so I couldn't be shoved around. You know, and I think it's horrible the way they do it. They give, sometimes it works, sometimes it's Steven Spielberg and all that time, but more often than not it isn't. So be wary of that. Be wary of that when suddenly someone offers you a film with a 250 million budget. Think twice, because that's a lot of money and they'll be all over you all the time, every minute of the day to do what they want you to do. It's brutal. It's sometimes said it's easier to get a first film. It's very difficult to get your second film, meaning that unless you'll know what you're going into within reason and you're prepared for it, whether it's a documentary or whatever, be careful and be warned, because you know sometimes you only get one shot, and you're appealing to a studio because you're cheap, you're anxious, you want to do it and all this kind of stuff. But you're someone that can be pushed around, and you can't be pushed around. I mean, you're always pushed around, but there are degrees of being pushed around. So anyway, be wary about that. But you know, had I had to do that film 20 years earlier, I would have shot myself. You know, I wouldn't have been able to get up in the morning. Anyway, so any questions? Shall I trudge on here?
Did your box office go up for that movie?
Yes, certainly did.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Not as spectacularly as when it moved from MGM to Sony, which were the first two Craig films. I think the first Craig film did over $1 billion. I was around the 400 million chicken feed, but yes, it did go up. Did I see another armor coming up? Yes.
I was wondering what were the two Native American films called?
The documentary is called Incident at Oglala. Oglala is where it took place, and the movie is called Thunderheart.
Okay. And I was wondering, especially in terms of the documentary, do you think that being that you were from the UK, that you were able to approach the
Yes.
subject matter differently?
I think so. Again, you know, I mean, it's not a bad thing not to know anything, because you can learn. What's a bad thing is if years of your upbringing have kind of pointed you in a certain direction. You know, I mean, the British are as mean-spirited and as high-minded as anybody. I'm not saying Americans are. I mean, I could never do a film about Northern Ireland, for example, because I have so much pent-up emotion and anger about it, one way or the other. And it would be difficult to be rational about it. And I think it helped a lot because, you know, there's a 900-page book by Peter Matheson called, I forgot what it's called Wonderful, In the Spirit of Crazy Horse, which gave you the whole history of the American Indians. And I read that, and that was really the first stuff I ever knew about it. And so then I did my research, and I went to the reservations, and I met people and all this on both sides. I tried to get to the FBI, but they wouldn't have anything to do with me. They refused to come into the film and all that. But I think, again, you're right. The fact that I didn't go in with years of prejudice from my parents or my, you know, siblings or whatever, I think in that case it's helpful. I mean, obviously, I mean, these are very specific kind of hot button topics that we're dealing with here, the Native Americans very much so, and still. You know, it's like racial issues in cities today. You know, we all go in with prejudices of some sort, and somehow, as a filmmaker, you've got to try and sort yourself out in a way, and try and keep even-handed about it, I think, because if you just make a piece of propaganda, that's all it becomes, is a piece of propaganda which can be easily dismissed and said, well, that's your view. So, yeah, I think in some ways it was. But let's now turn to something that I was totally at home with. It has been my whole life. Let's have a look at a chunk of 56 Up, which was my home territory, as it were. So this is the Up series, which started in 1964 when English society was going through what seemed to be a kind of a radical change. The United Kingdom was well known for being a place of privilege, not the American privilege of having money, but the privilege of having birth. Where you were born dictated your life, whether you didn't have to be born into money, but if you were born into the aristocracy or something like that, you could do certain things. If you were born on a building estate in East London, then you had pretty much no chance of achieving or getting the options that we wanted for someone to have. And at that period in the early 60s, British culture was upside down. It was the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, all these people from the working class and whatever were making millions of dollars. London was leading in fashion, and it was classless. And the thought was, is English society changing? Is this thing that's happening in Liverpool and whatever, and Manchester, whatever, is this actually changing English society? So it was decided at this television company I work with that why don't we just go out there and get a group of 7-year-olds together from the different class backgrounds and just have them talk a little bit about what their future is. Just a one-off film, just like that. And let's see whether or not England is changing. Well, we did this. We did it very quickly. We hardly spent much time choosing people, but we did. We went in and it caused a sensation because it proved horribly that English social life was a complete fuck-up. And that half the people could tell you where they were going to college, what careers they were going to, blah, 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 and the other half knew nothing. And there were people in the middle, but more of them later. So I was the researcher on that. I found the children, and a Canadian director directed it, and it was an interesting combination. I was only 22 at the time, and I was very political and very much on this case of social unfairness. And he was a very artistic film director. And so putting the two of us together, it was a bit rough. But nonetheless, he wanted to make nice pictures, and I wanted to have this very political thing going on. And the middle ground was excellent. I didn't get all my, and he didn't get all his pretty pictures in, but we made an interesting looking documentary which had a real beating heart to it. So then it was such a major event in British television, this documentary, this innocent little thing, because it never pushed it. We never pushed it. These people spoke for themselves. These 7-year-olds, out of the mouths of babes came these horrific truths about them. I mean, they were perfectly nice, decent kids and all that sort of stuff, but what they were saying was terrifying. But anyway, that we then decided eventually, rather too slowly, I thought, but anyway, to go back at 7 years later and see how they were doing and just go back and do them. And when we did the second one, then we knew we were onto something really big, that this was something, this could be a life's work. And I've made it a life's work. And so we went on and on and on, and we've done it 9 times with the same people on the whole. And I'll do 63 up in 2018. Probably be broadcast. It always goes out on television in Great Britain first. And you know, it's become quite a, as you kindly said, legendary, as it were, because it was a brilliant idea, but it was kind of an accidental idea, if you know what I mean. We didn't really know what we was doing, and then we realized what we were doing, and we grabbed hold of it. And although I moved to America full time in 1979 after I'd done 21 up, I vowed that I would always go back every 7 years to do this, which is a vow I kept, because I knew that this was going to be basically the cornerstone of my whole career, because this was something totally original. No one had ever done it before. I had a company, Granada Television, who was behind it and who still support it, because I've tried to do it in America and it's hopeless. You can't do it because the entertainment horizon keeps changing and companies sell out, buy out, whatever, because the key to this is you've got to have the rights to the old material. And if someone else owns them, then they're hard to get by, and it becomes so complicated. But the fact that Granada Television has been bankrolling this all these years, which has made them, it's given them a lot of prestige. Nonetheless, that's the only reason, other than my determination, that's kept the whole thing going. But anyway, so we've tried other ones. We've done one in Russia, which is brilliant. Again, because that's sort of financed by the state. What's brilliant about it, it's much better made than mine. It's much more elaborately made than mine, but you see how the whole nation is completely fucked. Everybody is fucked. So all those generations of these ghastly people that run the country and all this, it's left its mark, because you don't see much documentary stuff about Russian people who live in Russia. These are ordinary people. And it was horrifying, and still is horrifying. They're either on drunk or drugs or whatever. And these are ordinary people from different classes of society in Russia, they've had 200 years of being bullied and pushed around, whatever, and the last, 40 years or something have been as bad as anything else. So that was very interesting. And we did a South African one, which was heartbreaking, because by 21, 3 of them were dead. And it was weird, because we all know the statistics of dying of AIDS in Africa and all this, but until it comes into the rather homely world of an up film and you see people dead before they get to 21, somehow it hits hard. And we tried one in America, but we just got in a hopeless mess with the copyright of it. I think CBS did the first one and put Meryl Streep in front of it to introduce it, and then they pulled out. Someone else did 14. Someone else did 21, and by that time it was such a legal mess. Who owns what pieces of film? It died. And I've also tried to do a thing about marriage, which I wanted to do, was to do the same thing, because I always thought relationships are so interesting. And when we chose the people for the up films, which was based on the idea, today the people who are going to be running the country in the year 2000 are 7 years old. So the majority were men, because in the 60s, women had very little say, and in the thought that a woman would be prime minister. In fact, by 1978, whenever Margaret Thatcher came aboard, it's very male orientated, so there weren't enough women in it. And also, going back to the way we chose them, there was the clearly deprived people, and there were clearly people who had a lot of advantage, but the middle part, which we didn't get, that wasn't that interesting at 7, has turned out to be the most interesting thing. But we never got enough people in that middle ground, because it's the middle class who's been slaughtered in the last 50 years and continue to be slaughtered. Being slaughtered in your election and all this, living here and whatever. But I should have chosen people in the grey area of the middle ground. It wouldn't have made the first few films as dramatic, but in the end it would have had colossal impact when you see how people who were educated and all that just can't get jobs. People who had good education were left out to dry and all this sort of stuff. That's the history of the Western world, largely. The whole middle class has been shattered. But anyway, so I wanted to do a marriage thing, but again, we did one in 2002. I chose nine couples who the only thing that bonded them together was they all wanted to get married. One was a childhood sweetheart, one had only known each other, for 3 months or something. There were some racial, issues, there were some religious issues and all that sort of thing. So each of the 9 was a different set of truth, but we're sort of trying to get money to do the 3rd one, but even today I'm going off to see if I can get some more finances for it, but it's just impossible. So anyway, this whole longitudinal thing, as we call it, which sort of, I think, was accidentally invented by these up films. It's become now a huge business, because it's, film is so meaningful and so interesting to look at, that watching people grow up or people's attitudes changing on film is so much more interesting than having to read a great sociological book about it. So I suppose that of all things is the thing that I'm most proud of, and has been very sort of successful for me. So any questions on all that? Yes?
Yeah, I'm interested. If you have seen 112 Weddings by Doug Block, for example, where he was a wedding photographer and he decides to go back and check in on these couples.
Right.
And also Richard Linklater's Boyhood.
Yeah.
I think these are films that everyone connects to you in some way.
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, Linklater was a nervous wreck about it. I don't know him very well, I know him a bit, but he said, I've got to show you this film, because I want you to tell me what you think of it. And I think what he was worried about, that I was going to go around saying, you stole this for me, right? So I watched it and I met with him. He said, what do you think? I said, I think it's terrific. And he said, well, what's your advice? I said, keep going, which I don't think he's going to do, which I think is a mistake. But anyway, no, I don't think he certainly didn't steal the idea, and it's not, God knows, it's not an original idea. I mean, if he's stolen it, hundreds of other, as you say, pieces of film are stolen. I was just lucky to get in at the beginning. But no, I mean, he was nervous about it, but it was a terrific film, I thought. Yes.
I wanted to ask you about your relationships with the people now in the film.
Well, it's kind of complicated. I mean, some I never really see between films, because I don't live in England anymore. You know, some I'm quite close to. Some don't like me, and some do like me. It's the whole thing. I've only at 56. There were 14. I've only lost one forever. He pulled out at the age of 21. He did 21 up, and the joke is that he became a documentary filmmaker. So when he toned me down at 28, I behaved very, very badly. And he has never forgotten or forgiven me for that. I used every blasphemy I could think to abuse him for. My favorite thing is, if you live by the sword, you die by the sword. So if you're going to go out and make documentaries and you won't be in the one that you have been in, what sort of advertisement for that? And he turned out to be not a very good documentary filmmaker. He would have been much better if he'd stayed with me, as it were. So that's the only one I've lost. I've lost other people now and again, but they've come back. But it's just a long haul. It's the hardest part of it, is to getting them to come back, because they do like to torture me. But I do pay them for doing it, so they're in a predicament here. And since life in my great country is pretty tough economically, and not many of them have enough money really to turn money down or whatever, so there's all ways of persuading them to do it. But I've sort of got the feeling, perhaps from 49 upwards, that they did have a certain ownership in it. Because it's so interesting doing it, because I want them to tell me what to do. And now they're beginning to do that, which is great. I mean, bizarre things, when I nearly had a nervous breakdown when, I don't know how well you know it, but Susie, the very posh girl, who hated being interviewed all the time and was a real pain in the arse about the whole thing. She got a plan going with the person I most identify, who's the Yorkshire farmer, Nick, who's a scientist who went to America to live and work and all that. And they decided they wanted to do their interview together, because they were kind of exchanging emails over the years and all that sort of thing. I thought, oh my God. So this will wreck both of them. It'll be terrible, But I thought, I've got to do it, because this is what they want to do. And it worked out. She was much better than she'd ever been before, and he was warmer than he'd ever been before, but I thought it was a nightmare. But, if you live by the sword and you say to these people, well, what do you want us to do this time? You've got to do what they want you to do. You can't then say, well, no, I don't think I like that very much. So, and also they don't realize how powerful they are over me, because my main job is to get them together to do it. The rest of it sort of speaks for itself. I've used the same crew as much as I can all the time, and we know what we're doing, and I've got a wonderful editor and all this, but the big job is to get them to show up and do it. Some of you can't stop coming, or can't wait to do it, want to do it every year. But so that's the biggest kind of challenge for me. I don't know how I got onto that. how well do I know them? So, I mean, it's like a family. Some family I'm close with and some I'm not, and I don't push it. And I don't mind if I don't see them, because it's difficult it is not an easy film to do, because you don't want to make it just a continual repetition, i.e. asking the same questions. Because if you look at the films one by one, which is a life's work, I mean, looking at them so long, they are all different. They all have a different tone to them. And you may not even be aware of it. I may not even be aware of it until they've been out there for a year or two, and then you look at it and you think, Jesus, I thought this was about this, but it's about this. And that's very interesting. And so what I try and do, which is almost impossible, is I never prepare them for the interviews. I never tell them what I'm going to ask them. And I don't even know what I'm going to ask them, except I want to know what you're thinking about today, what is important in your lives. And because people criticize the film for saying, well, we never know where we are in history with them, we don't know what year we're in. And I've always said, well, the point is the politics of the film are these people and what they're living at that moment and what they're saying. And it was very vividly that was, came home to me. And 56 on, the English economy was going through a nightmare, as it is here. And it features very heavily in 56 Up, because these people approaching retirement and all that, they're concerned about their pensions and all this, and so it's on the front of their minds. But when I did 35 Up, England was even worse state. The miners were on strike, the unions were falling apart, Margaret Thatcher was kicking everybody's ass all over the place, and it's never mentioned once. No one ever mentioned it, because it wasn't impacting them. It had nothing really to do with them. So that's why the film makes its own political statements, and if you can bear to sit through them, they are quite different. I mean, there's still the iconic pieces, which I know I have to deliver. If someone said something ridiculously cute at 7 and at 14 and all that, and I'm going to use the original quote in the film, so you've got to pay attention to that. So there's certain things I have to deliver. But the challenge of the film is to try and make it the substance different each time. And I don't know what the substance is. I have to find out by talking to them. I'm a good deal older than them, so I don't know what's important to them. I think I'm 15 years older than them, so I don't know what's important. I don't even live in England anymore, so it has to be exactly about what they want to talk about and what interests them, and that's what I have to find out while I'm interviewing them. So I can't go in with a list of questions. I go in, as I said, with a list of what I know I have to deliver, i.e. what the audience is going to want to see, those famous lines of this kid saying, I want to be a something when I grow up and all that. So I don't spend any time with them talking about it at all. I mean, I do ask them what they want to do, and sometimes I'll have a good idea to film them in certain environments. I don't spend much time with them. But in terms of what I'm going to ask them, I don't tell them, because I really don't know either. And so I try and keep the relationship fresh. But some of them, if they come to California, they come and stay with me and stuff like that. And some I'm closer with than others, just emotionally and whatever. So there's no rule to it, except I think it's better in some ways to keep away and not to kind of be constantly, what are you doing, and all this sort of stuff.
What happens when one or two becomes famous in
Well,
the UK?
yeah, well, they do for a bit.
Change what they are looking for.
Well, I mean, that's always the unanswerable question, which sometimes is given to me in a very mean way, and sometimes in a loving way, like you with, have I changed their lives? They know they sort of have to answer to me in some way, and to the British public, and to quite a large audience these days, for what they've been doing. So do they brush up what they've been doing and start doing important things? And I have no idea. I know that the guy you saw here, Neil, had serious mental problems, and we did take legal advice when he was 28, and he loves doing it. And they said, if he loves doing it, do it. But I don't know if I've changed their lives. I don't know. They become famous for about 6 months after it's broadcast. and then it disappears into the background of people's lives, and then wacko, it comes in 6 years later, and again they become, and a lot of them really don't like it, don't like being picked out in a crowd or saying, oh, aren't you in What's It? But so far they've been turning up. Yeah.
Earlier this summer, we had a screening of one of our students' films, and the subject was there, and she said something like, I am so glad that you have found that I have like a focus or a direction in my life that I didn't really realize, sort of like she perceived that the film was like a condensing of what she felt was her diffuse life. Do you feel like you're presenting in the Up series something like that? Like
Oh, yeah.
a slightly different version than the
It's ridiculous how reductive I am about their lives, and they moan about it all the time. But I say to them, look, someone's got to do it. I mean, I shoot hours of material, and it has to be my judgment. It can't be their judgment, otherwise you never get anywhere. I mean, they see the film. Some of them insist on seeing it and insist on giving me notes about it, which sometimes I argue about and sometimes I do, but I have to do in the end what they want because they have huge power, because they will punish me by not showing up, and they know that's important. But yes, I mean, but it has to be, they have to trust my instincts about them. There's no other way about it, because you can't do this by committee. I have to make the judgment about what is important. Every time I have to make a judgment, because sometimes people have incredibly rich 7 years and some have incredibly boring. That's by my standards, but it's my standards that dominate the film. So, and they say, well, what happened to that bit, or what happened to this? And I said, well, I didn't use it because I didn't think it was as good as this other bit. But yes, I mean, they're pretty decent about it, but I think they must cringe when they see it, especially when, I interview them for 2 or 3 or 4 hours, and they think, Jesus, he put me through that, and there's about 14 seconds left, of what I said. So, but that's always the nightmare with documentaries when you do it. So you have to be pleasant and decent, but you have to be tough with them.
There's Tony, the cab driver, that seems
Yeah.
to like it quite a bit, who started
Yeah,
out
but
as
I
a
mean,
jockey.
he gave me the biggest trouble because, what was it? I mean, there was some issue. Was it about drugs in this one or something like that? I've forgotten what it was, but he was very upset by it. And he asked me to take it out, and I said I didn't want to take it out. And we talked about it, and I said, why don't you ask some other people about it? And he asked some friends, and they thought it was all right. I've forgotten what it was about, but it was very touchy business. It's about his marriage, I think, his infidelities and all this kind of stuff. Because in one of the shows, he actually, on film, admitted to his wife that he'd been unfaithful. And it was horrible, because the children were watching me shoot it in the next room, and they knew nothing about it. I mean, I didn't know what was going on, but that was a horrible moment when you saw that these kids had learned about their parents' marital problems, watching from a monitor me interviewing them in another room, interviewing their parents. So, it does get pretty near the bone sometimes. But we're still here. Yeah.
What happened with the Canadian director?
Paul Arman, well, he died. He was a freelance director who came to Granada's. I'll never forget it. There were 3 of them, Canadians, really top-class directors, and they came to do some big shows for Granada, and he got this assignment. But then he went back to Canada, and I took over at 14. And on the whole, it's been all right. He passed away a couple of years ago. We've had some difficulties. I've always been sure to give him credit on the film for doing it, but I think he's always felt somewhat upset about I get so much attention to it, and he doesn't. But I don't feel bad about it, because I do think that what I brought to it was this whole business of the English class system, which is the backbone of the whole thing, which he never understood. And it was quite difficult when we were making and cutting the film. So I don't feel I stole it from him. I mean, it wasn't his idea, it wasn't my idea, it was the Granada management's idea to do it. So he had no ownership on it, but he was unhappy about it. He wanted to get some of the reflected glory that I'd been getting from it, and it was awkward. But, you know, I think I treated him decently. I kept him involved in it at all, and I think it was all right eventually, but I was uncomfortable about it. But I didn't want to sell myself short, and I didn't want to misrepresent what he had done. So let's move on. How are we doing? Plenty of time.
Yeah.
Oh, go on.
I want to ask you something again, going back to Thunderheart.
Thunderheart.
And you always speak about making it real, the documentary,
Yeah.
and then making the feature film and making that
Yeah.
real. What does working with the actors add to that? What would a Val Kilmer do, or a Sam Shepard? What do they do, or what do you tell them to make it real, to find those moments that make the film good?
Well, in a way, it's an extremely big question, because what do actors do for you? And how do you handle actors as a director?
Yeah, and
You know.
actors who are then playing real.
Yes. Well, I mean,
Characters.
one of the joys of mixing up non-actors with actors in the same material is they learn from each other. I mean, I spend most of my life telling actors to take it down, to calm down, not to shout so much, or not to be so open about it, to be more natural, to trust the material more, so you don't have to act it with a big A. And when you get like that scene we saw with that old man and John Trudell with Val, you know, the actors pick it up. But the sort of film acting I like, and great actors can do it, you know, the best actors in America can do it, is as a kind of reality they bring to it. Whatever it is, however they do their craft, old DiCaprio can bring, you're not always watching him, you're watching his version of something else. And that's what these actors bring to it, like what a writer will bring to it is nuance and stuff like that, which the actor can't bring to it and the director doesn't bring to it or whatever. I'm sort of the kind of, you know, the circus master in a sense, but sometimes, and it depends what the material is, especially it was helpful on this Native American thing to have real, well, they had to be the real people in the documentary, but to have as many people from the reservation actually in it, because it gives it a voice, a genuine voice. And when you look at the history of Hollywood with the films about Native Americans, it's appalling. Appalling. Sal Mineo doing his Native American and all this kind of stuff. I mean, it's well-meaning, but it's especially as taste has changed and people, I think, are more interested in the real world. You know, I mean, the days of Hollywood and big stars overacting and all this kind of stuff, you know, it's still around. And, you know, you say that La La is a bit like that, and that's great that they brought back that kind of La La Land, yeah. That, you know, what's it? Ryan Gosling and Emma Stone are doing performances, but they're part of a genre which is high entertainment. But when you're looking at realistic films, and not Marvel films, but realistic films, I think an audience does, on its heart, want to believe what it's seeing, and doesn't necessarily say, oh, Mr. Hackman is on form here, or he's off form here. So for me, everything we do serves the material and the story, not necessarily the script, but the story, you know, what it's based on. So, you know, again, I'm always, as a director, trying to bring people down from what is thought to be good acting, which is usually, especially in my great country, theatrical acting, because we are a great theatre nation.
Right. I'd like to ask you about your second American film, because you mentioned, and we looked at Coal Miner's Daughter, which ended up winning Sissy Spacek the Academy Award and won other awards and nominations. what then did you do for the second film? Why did you decide to do Continental
Well,
Divide? And
Yeah.
we also have a clip when you're
Yeah,
ready for that.
yeah. Well, I was going to say, let's try and have a few laughs. But and I had a history of working with comedians, and I don't think. Well, let's put a pin in that because I'm going to answer that question. But let's show a piece of Critical Condition, which is starred Richard
That's
Pryor.
on my USB, Critical Condition.
Are there more than one clip, or are there two clips?
I think it's just the trailer. Just
Oh, it's just a trailer. Okay, this is a film, a kind of silly film set about a big blackout in Staten Island, and as it were, the inmates running the asylum, i.e. the patients running the hospital. And this was a vehicle for Richard Pryor, who was a wonderful comedian. So that was a bit of a laugh. It didn't work very well, but nonetheless. So anyway, I do like comedians as actors. And when I'd finished Coal Miner's Daughter, one of the biggest comedians on the planet was John Belushi. And he had an interest in playing a straight role. And we had this very good script set in the Chicago newsroom about a newsman who is sent out on assignment to meet a woman whose job is to protect bald-headed eagles in Colorado or something like that. So let's show a clip from that. That's called Continental Divide. So, it presented a lot of problems, so that's why I took it. I mean, I was quite hot at the time. Then I got quite cool, but anyway, so anyway, he was, yes, also a trailer. But so this was the film I did after Coal Miner's Daughter. So anyway, I did that film, and it was kind of somewhat unfortunate in a way because he really worked hard. It was kind of sad. He was at the height of his power, and he really wanted to do this. And although he was kind of difficult to deal with, he was kind of a child in some ways, and he made me a father figure for him. He really worked hard. He got off drugs, and he worked out and all this kind of stuff. And it's only when we were back to Chicago to do the last month that his friends, quote unquote, got him back on all that kind of stuff. But I think the flaw with the film was that his audience didn't want to see this film, and an audience who might want to see a kind of adult, quite well-written romance didn't want to see John Belushi in it. So in a sense, we were all kind of stuck in the middle. It did all right, but it wasn't really it wasn't for me the sort of follow-up I needed to Coal Miner's Daughter. But I mean, he was the funniest man I've ever been in the presence of. I mean, in life, he was just incredibly funny. So I've had the odd trip into this wasn't a trailer, was it? That was a scene. Yeah, okay. But anyway, so yes, that's been my movements into comedy, as it were. So
is comedy harder to do though?
Yes, terribly difficult to do because you don't know whether it works. You sit there and you watch Richard do something and you're crying with laughter. Then you get back and you look at it and you think, oh, crikey. Or you put it together with the next scene. It's the most difficult thing to do.
How different were they in personality to work with?
Well, Richard was ill. He had everything. He was a recovering alcoholic, a recovering addict and everything. And he was in very bad shape. And he was kind of remote the whole time. I mean, he did the business, but he was going through a very, very tough time, which he never really ever came through. John was, he behaved like a child and all that, but he really wanted to do it. He really wanted to do it well. And I believe he could have been a terrific actor. He only did one more film after this before he died. But I thought he had great possibility as a character actor. I would have used him again.
Why do you think he wanted to do something serious like that?
Because he was a serious guy, and I think he could see, you know, there was an end game, or there was an end to how long he could keep doing all this, the jokes and all the Saturday Night Live stuff and whatever, that, you know, that was, you know, the comedy keeps changing and all that, and I think he had a perception that, you know, he'd have to find, because I think he knew he could do it, you know, I think he knew he could act. He really went after this, and he persuaded me to do it. He brought it to me and talked me into doing it and all that. So I think he knew that he had ability to do it. And, you know, I think he would have been terrific. I think he would have been done, you know, very, very well. Like Steve Martin or someone that have a career as a comedian actor, or other people, you know, Bill Murray, stuff like that. But, you know, he was too badly damaged, basically. I mean, you know, the previous 15 years he'd been doing what he'd been doing. I mean, he was badly damaged. But it was a great sadness. It wasn't a surprise, because, you know, you knew he was hanging on for like grim death to try and get through it and to do well and whatever. So it was very sad, but I think it was sort of inevitable what happened to him. So a lot of you are interested in documentaries. So I bought bits of just a couple of documentaries. I did a kind of 2 documentaries which go side by side, and generally they were called inspirations, and I was very interested in how people had ideas to do things. And so I got Paul Allen of what fame? What did he invent? Microsoft. To give me $1 million to make 2 films, one about scientists, how they have ideas, and one about artists, how they have ideas. And so what I did is I chose 6 artists and 6 scientists and interviewed them and saw them. I never juxtaposed them. I mean, I never intercut between the films or even between the people. I just presented 6 artists and 6 scientists and have them talk about how they work, really, and how they keep going and whatever. So I brought one of the artists, who's David Bowie, who said, what I'll do is I'll write a song for you. So we all showed up, and he wrote a song for us. So let's put that up. It's only a bit of it, so. So now you know. What a great man he was. Has Maurice been here Maurice Alberti, has she been here to talk to you? Well, she shot a lot of my documentaries. So let's just end. I'll show you the bit. This documentary is The Scientists, which was called Me and Isaac Newton. So if you can find that and chuck that up. Okay, there you go. That was just a trailer for it. So, and I did a guy who was researching cancer and all this, and I went back to them about 10 years later to see how they were doing, which was all right, but some of them had passed away. And the man from doing cancer said, now, you know, we don't try and cure it, we try and contain it. So anyway, how about that? That'll do, won't it?
That was a good one.
Yeah. So, no, I quite like those sort of documentaries as well as the kind of observation ones, the fly-on-the-wall one. You got any?
I was just going to say, what did you find the main differences between the doctors or scientists and the artists?
It's to me, it was very, very simple, that scientists are much more articulate because they have to know what they're doing, because they rely on getting grants to work. So every so often they're having to say to people, this is what we're doing, I now need X million dollars to do this or whatever. So they're always having to analyze what they do and present what they do. They're endlessly having to write magazine articles and make, you know, audition to finances, whereas you know, the artistic thing is much more loosey-goosey. I mean, you know, they're all over the place and they can't really tell you. I mean, I spent some time with Ray Lichtenstein just before he died. And, you know, he's a lovely man, wonderful man, but I mean, he couldn't really explain to me, you know, what had driven him. I mean, Bowie was about the most articulate of all the artists, really, but it's because, in a sense, their whole thing is to be different and new and to not be seen to copy and whatever it is. So they can be much more loosey-goosey, and some of them don't need lots of money to do what they're doing. So there was just something, I mean, it's pretty crass and obvious, but you know, scientists were much more organized and much more, not much more thoughtful, but you could follow the train of thought. They were much more, quote, articulate than artists were, because sometimes the artists couldn't really explain why they did it, they just do it. You know, and a lot of the ones I talked to, I had a wonderful woman who lived on a reservation in New Mexico who was doing beautiful pottery work and stuff like that. You know, and a lot of them had very simple lives and, you know, didn't need much money to do it. So it was a whole different mindset, which I suppose is obvious, but these films kind of, I thought, brought that out.
How much input did Paul Allen have?
Zero. I mean, he was perfectly nice. I only met him once, and he said, go off and do it. I mean, he had his people who were vaguely annoying, who wanted to do things. No, but I mean, he was very good. I mean, he just said, he was kind of like a dream. I mean, he's so unbelievably rich that $1 million to him was like a dime in my pocket, as it were. But no, he was a good man, and he was interested in it too. You know, they didn't do a very good job selling it. That's the problem. If you make films for very rich people, as a kind of toy for them, then they don't have to make money back from it. But it's much better if you make films for people who are desperate for them to succeed, so they will see the whole process through. You know, you deliver the work and you do the work, then you want people to see it. You know, and that can be enormously difficult, whatever you're doing, and also needs a lot of money to do it. So I've given up the idea of, you know, doing little pieces for rich people, because in the end they never really have the interest in, you know, they show them at their houses or stuff like that. I mean, I'm exaggerating a bit, but you know, there's no impulse to make the money back. But you know, if you're doing a movie for a studio or for an independent company, then you hear nothing else but how are we going to get our money back, and when is it coming in, and all that. So it's not an ideal situation. It was nice at first. Were you just stretching, or were you going to ask?
I was just stretching.
Oh, okay, fair enough.
Finish your thought, I'm sorry, I'll ask you a question afterwards.
Okay.
Can you talk a little bit about the way that you work with your editors, especially on the documentaries?
Yeah, it's a well, I mean, I've been lucky with editors. I mean, editing a documentary is incredibly creative job. I mean, it is editing a movie, but doing a movie is much more detailed and much more about nuance and performance and stuff like that. And sometimes you have an editor who doesn't quite understand what you were trying to get out of the actor or whatever. So, I mean, not that I'm smarter than they are, but I knew what I was doing at the time and what the energy was between me and the actor. So I think I have to take more time with editors doing movies or do narrative films. I think and I have a wonderful woman who cut a lot of these, Suzanne Rostock. I think I'd ask more of a documentary editor, you know, to be more original and put more input in, particularly as they usually have a huge amount of material to deal with. You know, on a movie you shoot relatively little, you know, but with a movie with a documentary you can just bang off, especially in these days of, you know, of video and all that. You can just shoot hours and hours of stuff. But I try and be helpful, but I do rely more heavily on a documentary editor, I think. And with the Up films, the same guy has done it since 21. So, you know, he's incredibly knowledgeable about the material and all that, and everything is digitized, so we keep everything. Stuff I don't use is kept, because you never know what's going to happen down the road. But I think I feel less comfortable with a documentary editor. I feel I know less what I'm talking about with them than I do with someone who's doing narrative for me. I mean, that sounds contradictory to what I said at the beginning when I said you've got to know what you want, but I'm talking more about the details of it. I mean, I know the thrust of what I want, but how it could be, you know, how it could be manufactured or whatever is another matter. So again, you know, what I don't ever do is just dump 40 hours of film at someone's feet and say, turn it into a documentary. I won't do that, but I'll give them serious kind of outlines about how I want it. But then after that, I'm really relying on them to bring it to life, because I can't remember what I shot most of the time, because you shoot so much stuff, you know, if you're so, you know, I think there's a difference between the way I have, as I said, an editor for theatrical stuff or narrative stuff and for documentary stuff. But it's a crucial relationship, and you've also got to get on, because you are stuck in a dark room for months. I mean, I don't care if I don't get on with the DP or the AD, as long as they're good at their job, that's fine. But if you don't get on with your editor, you are in trouble. You know? So be careful. They don't have to be your best friend, but it does have to be someone you can spend a lot of time with and have a lot of tension with sometimes. So it's a very, very important choice, particularly with a documentary thing. And it's, you know, you want them to have the same taste as you have, so you want them to, and you know when you're in trouble too. And it's very bad news to be in trouble with the documentary editor, not on a personal level, but if you feel that they don't get it or they don't get you, there's not much you can do about it. You are sunk. You know, I mean, there's only a certain path that you can take, a certain detail you can get involved in. So be wary of that, unless you're going to edit your own stuff, which is also dangerous, I think. You know, you do need, it's very important to have other eyes look at it. It's very important to preview films, although it's painful beyond belief to have people mock your work and all this kind of stuff. But you've got to grow up and realize that you aren't making it for yourself. At the end of the day, you're making a commodity. You know, you're making something that people have invested money in and want some return in. I mean, you have lots of high ideals about what you do, but you know, you do have to find an audience, and the only way to find an audience is to test work with an audience. You know, because the Up films are very, very difficult to cut because I've got so much material. You know, I'm very careful that I show those a few times, not to anybody, but to people I know, just to find out, because I'm so involved in it. You know, it's so much part of my life that I need some outside, 3 or 4 outside people to look at it, who aren't invested in it in the way that I am, you know, to give me some hard truths about it. You know, this is ridiculous, or this one's no good at all, or we must have more of that, because that really is a nightmare to put that together. So it's always good. You can't be too, it's painful, but you can't be too protective about what you have, because ultimately you are making something that you want to transmit to people. You want people to see, you're not just making it for yourself. Yeah.
You spoke a little bit earlier about showing your cuts to the subjects of the Up series.
Yes.
Is that something you do with all the subjects of your documentaries?
No,
or just
no, never. No, I mean, I only do it with them because they have me over a barrel. Some of them don't ask for it, but some of them who are savvy know, you know, that if they don't like something, why should I toss it out to the general public? So no, I don't like to show documentaries to Because usually there's some evil notion behind the documentary or something that you have, that you don't want to disclose to everybody. So if I can avoid it, I mean, if people insist on seeing it, I don't have much choice, but it's not something I offer up saying, do you want to check this out for me? Because no one's going to like it. I mean, how can they? I mean, I hate looking at myself, anything I do, I hate it. And so I'm sure most people, if they're filmed and they have to watch the film, it's so creepy to watch yourself babbling away up there.
Have you gotten good response or feedback from your subjects in most of the documentaries?
Yeah, I mean, people tend not, if they don't like it, they tend not to tell you. They're pretty decent about it. I mean, I'm sure they've all got, but generally I mean, this sort of stuff, I think, I don't know how many of them watch, this film is just mainly an illustrated interview. But people aren't usually cruel to me, because I'm not cruel to them, usually. But I don't, I mean, I suppose you do get reviewed, and so you care about that, only because, reviews do help sell the film. But you have to be very grown up about, the world, the mass of reviews that you get if you do a major movie, because that's a pretty chilling experience. Reading Rotten Tomatoes is not very much a nice way to relax, as it were. Because they've gone back in time, so they've gone back to some of the stuff I've done, and they've said some very unpleasant things about, which really annoys me. It always annoys me when people criticize me, but I have to be grown up. Anyway, this is hard. Yes?
Can I ask about working in prestige TV?
Yes, yes.
What's that like?
Well, it's both good, worth doing, and horrible. I mean, it's a lot of, the movie business is changing so much. It's so difficult to get jobs for people like me, apart from my age. But for people who do the sort of stuff I do, sort of dramas, middle of the road sort of stuff.
Yeah, is there room for that in this industry?
And what?
Is there room for that in film?
Not at the moment, no, and it's all cyclical. I'll explain my theories about the cycle. When I wanted to come to America, American movies at the end of the 70s into the 80s were fantastic. Just get out a book of Academy nominations, the best 5 films in the 80s, and it's unbelievable how many great films there are there. But I was in America when I first went there, when the roof fell in. There were 2 events. Was the opening of Star Wars and the opening of what was Spielberg's film? E.T., was it? Anyway, there was another one. Jaws. Jaws opened, and the Lucasfilm opened, and then the movie industry was fucked. Then, for that moment on, and it took 25 years, it became a business, and it's nothing more than a business now. It's how much can you invest, how much can you get back on your investment. People who make decisions have no interest in films, don't know anything about films. People who interview for jobs don't know anything about films. It's a nightmare. And so, first of all, the first big change was in the 90s when Soderbergh came along with Sex, Lives and Videotapes, and in a way was the signal for a whole world of independent movies to start coming out. And these studios, they were left high and dry. All people who wanted to make films were doing independent films. But then the tragedy of that was the studios bought up the independent companies, and they became like studios and all that sort of stuff. And so then, the feature film industry, began to get narrower and narrower and narrower as the economic issues got bigger and bigger and bigger. And now we're in the thing when we may be coming out of it, where television is the only place you can go. And we may be coming out of it because it's unsustainable. There's so much stuff being done, so much money being spent on stuff, and it's And it's very good stuff. It's much better than most movies. The choice you get on cable television from HBO, Showtime, Netflix, all of them, blah, blah, blah. It's where the American film industry is. But I don't know how long they can keep it going because they spend tons of money. And I don't know how much money they recoup unless you're Netflix and all that sort of stuff. So I think we're all a bit worried that this halcyon days we're in now. But it is fun to do them because the scripts are good, the stories are fresh, the actors are great. What kills me is the post-production. I can't stand it. They give you 4 days to cut it, and then that's the last you see of it. Then it goes to the producers, then it goes to the network, then it goes to all this, whatever it is. I mean, unless you're in a very strong position, and maybe you've created it or something like that if you're a creator. But
So does your input come in pre-production then, in an episode?
well, I mean, you get 7 days to prepare it, you get 8, 9 or 10 days to shoot it, and 4 days to cut it. And when you think that's what it is, the quality of some of the work is remarkable, what people get out. But I mean, you're operating on fumes, you're operating on years of experience, and so you know how to schedule an hour television show, you know how to shoot it and all this, but cutting is quite different, and it's so depressing. I'm going through that at the moment. Makes me actually want to cry. I mean, I've just done 2 episodes of Masters of Sex, one of which goes out on Sunday, and the finale of the 3rd season, which goes out in 3 weeks' time. And I've never even seen anything beyond my cut of the finale. And I hear all these things going on, and I just can't stand it. It's horrible.
Directing an episode.
Huh?
How many do they give you different guidelines of what you can catch? Just because there's a through line of how a series is supposed to
Yes,
look.
yeah. Well, I mean, you've got to know what you're into. I mean, you know that you've got to fit in, and you've got to do your homework. You know, I mean, I've done a lot of Masters of Sex. I mean, in the 2nd season, I did 1, 2, 3, and 8. So I sort of set the whole thing up, and so I knew where I was on this one, and I've done some Ray Donovan too. And when you come in, you have no idea. You get the script, and you have no idea what's going on. So you've then got to do your homework. You know, you've got to read old scripts, see cuts of earlier episodes, and all this. I mean, that's half the job to know, because you can't get yourself caught out by the actors. You say, well, why don't you know what we're supposed to be doing? So, you know, just the quality of the work is much superior to a lot of the film work that we get offered to do, or that ends up in the cinemas. And it is a source of income, yeah.
In that same line, there's a lot of documentary work that's been done on television that it's more of a series.
Yes.
And like.
Yeah, and I think it's very good. Yeah, I mean, what's happened is with that, the other thing about cable, spending more money is the whole idea of the way you present it on television has, I mean, I could, if I was doing the up film now, I could probably have 4 hours of screen time, 5 hours of screen time. These long-term documentaries, some of which are terrific. I mean, we never had that opportunity. The scheduling of documentaries up to, I don't know what broke the back, but I mean, up to 2 years ago was always, here it was, it had to be 60 minutes or 75 minutes, or if you were lucky, maybe it could be 2 hours or whatever. But now that's broken wide open through HBO and Showtime and whatever. And now, as you say, it's wide open. And I'm not so threatened, I'm not so worried about that, because documentaries are much cheaper to do. But some of the production values of some of these series is phenomenal. I mean, and you don't know how they can afford it, because you don't know, how much money they get back.
And it sort of kind of like makes me wonder how much into the story of a documentary can you go, because when you're limited by an hour.
Yeah, of course, of course.
It's a 90-minute.
Yeah,
That's it.
absolutely. I mean, that thing about the making of a murderer, you could never have made that film, except in recent times. I mean, I think all that's wonderful. I mean, that is, and as I said, I don't think it's prohibitively expensive. I mean, I think you can And I think it attracts more people to watch documentaries too. I mean, people get caught up in them. So I think that, and I think that's a great gift from the gods, you know, the way that the whole thing about showing documentaries on cable television has, you know, removed that nightmare of having to fit a particular time thing. But I just worry about the theatrical part of it because they are so expensive, these things. I mean, the money these actors get, I mean, to do a successful one, they've always got to get a movie star in it. I mean, these people are asking for a shitload of money, like $500,000 to, you know, I mean, I don't see how these companies can sustain that. Anyway, I've got to go now.
Thank you.
That's all right, my pleasure. Okay, thank you. Interesting probably to you about what I've done is that I've mixed up documentaries and feature films and how I work between the two, etc., etc. So there are not many of us who do that, so it's a little pin in my lapel, as it were. So the whole morning will kind of feature that in one way or the other. So let's just start with this clip from Coal Miner's Daughter, and then I'll explain why you're watching it. So the purpose of this was, I made this film in 1980, and it was the first film I did in America. I'd been working, directing for 15 or so years in the United Kingdom, and during all my early years I was moving around between documentaries and television plays and all this because I worked for a small company that didn't really afford to have either or, so you had to do both and whatever. And I got sent this script. I was dying to work in America. I loved American films. The 80s was a great period for American films, the golden age. And I came here and I got this script and I got the job. And so I went about the job. And I went about a job that had the studios, Universal Studios, known what I was doing, they would have had a heart attack. They didn't even realize I was shooting the film on location until the weekend before I started. I got away with it because it was a low-budget film and they knew they'd get their money back on the soundtrack from Loretta Lynn. But anyway, the way I approached it, the way I'd learned my stuff in the United Kingdom with many mentors, Ken Loach, people like that, was if you're going to do a film about somewhere, you went there to do it. And so out I went to meet Loretta and to have a look at the Appalachians and to see her on the road and all this kind of stuff. With my intention was to shoot the whole thing on location, which is what I did. We recorded live singing out there. I had a sound recording unit there. And
well, I run the Filmmakers Dialogue series with the School of Visual Arts, and the first time I met Michael was when I invited him to participate with a movie called Batangang Kipper Bang in 1982, which was a small film made by Channel 4 about two young kids and first love kind of story. So Michael shows up and I met him and everything was nice, but the only thing that didn't show up was the film because the distributor, United Artists, forgot to send the film. But we got through that and the film came another day. And throughout the years, I've become friends with Michael. And you know, if you look at IMDb or Wikipedia, the first thing it says is that he's one of the most prolific filmmakers working, which is true because he has 76 movies that he's directed. I don't know how you've done that, but they range from the
I have
James...
a whole army underground.
Yeah.
I pass them out.
I mean, some of the titles would be from Narnia to the James Bond film to Thunderheart to the documentaries Incident of Ogalla, and of course the 7 Up series, which is classic, and everybody who has anything to do with documentaries has such a great love for that program. So we'll go through a lot of the films that Michael has directed, I guess, and we'll start with a clip from Coal Miner's Daughter. But first, here's the legendary Michael Apted. Is that okay to call you
A
legendary?
wet legend.
One legend?
A wet legend. No, this is my habitat. Rain from England. It always rains in England. So can I sit here and will they see the stuff? So we're going to amble through some stuff I've done, mindful that what's interesting.
I mean, did you approach it differently
It's a good,
as
a
from
very
someone who lived here and would
It's a
have
very
known?
good question, because there's a number of films made by British directors that are kind of seminal. There's, what was the John Boorman film? Set in Deliverance. Deliverance, Midnight Cowboy. And they were tended to be dealing with subjects that hadn't really been touched on very much. If I was to come here and do a film about Vietnam, I wouldn't do it. I just simply wouldn't take it on, because it's something I never lived through. Civil rights, something that being grown up in the United Kingdom, I knew nothing about that. And my friend Alan Parker took a bit of a battering for, what was his film called? Mississippi Burning, because again, he didn't really know what he was talking about. I mean, he's a great filmmaker, but he didn't know what he was talking about. So I think in some instances it does help. I mean, I came out looking kind of golden here because, God, I hadn't been, I hadn't trashed the Appalachian people. I hadn't patronized country music. It's because I didn't know any better, not because I was a better person than anybody else. Here was this singer, and here was this environment. This is where she lived, so we'll shoot it here. But it was a lesson to me that I presented a truthfulness because I didn't go in with too many preconceptions. It's good, everybody has preconceptions, but if you know something about something, some of those preconceptions are useful. But I never had any preconceptions about it because I knew nothing about it. So I'm not suggesting that everybody goes out and makes films about something they don't know about at all, but to go for the documentary truth of something, which you can always do with ever movie you do. I did it with the James Bond film to a point. It can be a great help and it can also be a hindrance. You just have to be smart about the material you choose.
How much time do you spend with the real people, like Loretta Lynn and the people?
I went on the road with her, and they were really horrible to me. She travels in a bus, and they made me sleep above, that bit of the thing that drives the engine along. And miserable sods. I mean, so I just spent about a week with her, never getting any sleep at all. So I said to them, "I'm going to punish you." This is me to myself, and I certainly did punish them. Because when I came to do this was with the band and her. She was wonderful, but the band was horrible to me. So when I came to do lots of concerts with her, I made them change costume every single song. I absolutely, and they didn't realize that I was torturing them. I was torturing them, but I was reminded of all those horrible nights trying to sleep on this fucking bus. So there's a mean streak to me. Anyway, so having set up that sort of my life in a way, I was then, about 10 years later, I was asked to do a documentary about Leonard Peltier. It's a story that took place in South Dakota when on the Pine Ridge Reservation there was a lot of political activity with the American Indian movement and a lot of action from the Nixon government and a lot of tension between the Native Americans and the government. And there was a murder where 2 FBI operatives got killed. And 3 men were charged, 2 were acquitted, and Leonard Peltier was convicted of it and sent to prison for life, and he's still in prison. Anyway, I was sent off to make a documentary about it, sort of in a way to say that American justice hadn't been at its very best and all that sort of stuff. While I was doing that, I got a script sent to me, which was about exactly the same subject. So I thought, hello. So I went up for this film, and of course I knocked them dead. I cast it. I played this scene because the only 2 people who'd ever been in front of a camera in this scene was Sissy and Tommy Lee Jones. The rest of them were kids who were at the school. And that was the tone of the whole film. And in a sense, it came out remarkably well because Hollywood American films that had a pretty bad record doing stuff in the Appalachians. They were all Hollywoodized and glamorized and whatever. I mean, there's some great films, Nashville and whatever, but nonetheless there was something wrong about them. And this, unwittingly, I didn't know I was doing it, I was just doing my work in the way I did. Here was a film which was actually about the people and had the real people in it and the real locations in it. And because not many people knew much about this world, they knew about the music. I mean, Loretta was a big star, and it was the age of country music, Willie Nelson, etc. But anyway, this film illuminated, in a sense, a whole different world to the American audience. And so it was for me a very successful beginning, and I'm still living off it, 40 years later practically. But anyway, so that was really a very powerful lesson to me. It made me articulate my thoughts a bit about how to work, which was in a way second nature to me because that's all I knew. But the fact was that even in something as American as this, and I'd never heard of Loretta Lynn, didn't know anything about it before I came to go to work on the film, that there's no substitute for being there, no substitute for the truth of the matter, which is really, I suppose, the theme of all my work all the way through. Sometimes it's worked out, sometimes it hasn't worked out. But anyway, that's, please ask questions at any time during this, otherwise I'll just babble on forever. But I've got lots of clips to show, so it won't be too much. But if you want to ask anything.
I just wonder.
What?
Yeah, me.
Oh, you?
Yes. If since you were coming in not knowing much about Loretta Lynn,
Yes.
do you think that helped?